Okay, so I wanted to go over some things with Angular and testing for all of our Angular services and stuff, and also just kind of give a general overview over how the Karma framework works again and some of the things that we can do with it. So the first thing I want to show right now is we have created over in WIP, and I'm hoping to check this in today once we take trunk and move it on top of WIP, a little bit of the structure. And so you'll see here we'll have a OIT GLM, a OIT batch, the modules, and lib, which is basically the same thing that we have today. So we look into OIT GLM, you'll see a lot of the same files that we already have. The three files that you really want to know a lot about is this Karma config.js. Let's open that up real quick. Which is this file right here. And what this does is it sets up your Karma test harness with all of the things that you need to run Karma with. The next one is the grunt.js file. What grunt.js does is it will run JavaScript tasks for you. And so one of the tasks that we do have is the Karma task. And then we also created a test task that run all of these tasks, and I'll explain that in a little bit. And then the last one will be Bower.js. And what Bower is it's a package management system that you can put your modules or your application up into a central repository and then fetch those items when you need them. Okay, and so here you see we put jQuery, Angular, Bootstrap, resources, Analytics, and ng upload in our Bower.js so that we can just run Bower install and it will download all of the dependencies that we have for our application. So it just makes it a little bit easier to manage your components that you're dependent on and what versions you want to use. So when we go to 2.1, we just have to change this to 2.1 and this to the latest version. This will always get the latest 1.0 version that it can get. And that way the different projects, if they have to use a different version of a dependent JavaScript, they can. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Karma config.js file. Okay. So what we have at the top is the base path. So this is just where do you want to run these tests from, and where do you start looking for your files. And so all base paths will almost always be just the base. Wherever we run this, wherever the Karma config.js file is, that's what we're going to run, and that's where we're going to run it from. Okay. Next piece is the framework, and so you can see here that frameworks that you can use is Jasmine, Mocha, and QUnit. We're using Jasmine. The next section is files, and this is very important. What this is all the files that Karma needs to be able to run. So you see at the very top here up to this point, these are basically all just helper JavaScript files that we need. You see the jQuery, the Angular, the resources, the mocks, the OIT services, and OIT UI. So these are just all of the different JavaScript files that we need to be able to run all of our different tests. Then we have the js/star.js. What this is the actual items that we want to test. So when we look at our file structure here, it will be this guy right here. The **/* means any folder underneath this JS directory. So this is the services, filter, directives, and controllers. So this main JS will be captured by this particular piece. And then the last line on there is the actual test. So if we go into GLM, test, specs, you can see it's any directory underneath that with the JS. So you see the JS there. Okay. Now we can also exclude files. Is running on the exact same format here, just an array of files or directories that we do not want to test. The next line here is the port. So one of the things is that when Karma runs, it can open up a browser so that it can run the test within its JavaScript framework. And so this is just the port that it's running on when it's trying to do the testing. Log levels, then auto watch. I'll talk about this in just a second, and then the browsers. And so this is just an array of browsers. I'm using the Phantom.js, which is a headless JavaScript engine. And what that means is it will not launch a browser, but you can also put in IE if you have IE installed on your machine, Chrome, Chrome Canary, Firefox, Opera, Safari, any of the browsers, or you can do a multiple browsers. So you can do, I want to test in Chrome, IE, and Phantom, and it will launch all three of those browsers and then try to run your test within those browsers, and you get triple the number of accounts that you want. So let's talk about the single run and auto watch. So single run, what it means is that it will run the test only once, and that's it. And once it gets done, finished running the test, then it will stop the test runner. So for continuous integration, we will always run this as a single run. Auto watch, on the what it says is that if any of the files above in your files directory gets changed, then you want to run the test over again. So if I have this as false and this is true, that means as the test, as I make changes to my JavaScript, it will automatically run all of the tests to tell me whether the changes I made have either broken a test or a test is successful. Okay, so that's the config file. There's a few more items we can add on there, and we will. We look at what we have today in the current GLM. You'll find down here we have a preprocessor. And what the preprocessors do is it allows us to run a coverage module, which means we'll be able to see how much the test has covered our code and give us a report. And then you also have what they call reporters. Currently we're just using dots, which means it just shows little dots on every single one of the pieces that you ran. JUnit produces an XML that is a JUnit XML that you can use for other third-party reporters that can use that JUnit XML and give you reports on it. So Jenkins will use that particular one. Okay. Any questions on that? I don't see anything in your dialog. Okay, so let's talk about Grunt for real quick because it is something that will run. So when you look at a Grunt task file, you'll see here there's required, and this is just telling the system what you are wanting to use from your node modules directory. And then we have the configuration. And so if you come down here, there is a Karma configuration. Oops, just passed it. There it is. And so we have Karma here. And what we're saying here is that we have a subtask called units. And whenever we call Karma :units, this is the overriding configuration we want to do. And so here we tell it what config file we want to use. We are telling it that we want to have it continuously running. We don't want to do it just a single run. We're doing the reporters of dots and JUnit, and we're using the browser of Phantom.js. So if we run this as a grunt task that is Karma units, then it will run with this configuration to overwrite your Karma config.js. And then down here, you can see where we actually are taking that particular unit test, and we added a new task called test, which first cleans things moves some files over, auto prefixes stuff, and then runs the comma test. Okay. So let's get into the actual writing of tests. So I want to shut this down real quick. So the first thing I wanted to, and we'll do probably a call next week over this, but we have created a Yeoman generator that is unique for this team. And so when we do a new service, we can do a TR app service, and we'll call it new service. And when we run this particular command, yo TR app :service new service, what it will do is actually go out and create a default new service in the service directory, and also create a default test. Okay, so you can see here when it finished, it created both those pieces. So when we now come into our app, let's see here. Here's the default creation of this app. Okay, and it basically just gives you a empty shell at that point. At the very same time, it created a test for us. Okay, so I want to talk about this particular test real quick because it's the basic test that we need to run on any service that we created. Okay. So at the very top here, we have what we call a describe. And what describe does is it tells Jasmine that this is a block of tests that I want to run. And anything in between my brackets, I will run as part of this test unit. So in this particular one, it says that we are testing services. It's the new services, and then we have a function. Okay. You can actually embed describes inside of a describe. So you can have a describe that says, I want to test all my services, and then inside of it, do another describe that says, I only want to test my stuff in new services. Okay? And so you can actually group things that way. I don't think we really should be doing that much because it can get really complicated because of these before eaches. Because the before each only happens within a describe. And so if you start nesting describes, it can get really complicated on your before each. Next line here is creating of the module and importing the module. So this says before every single one of these integrated tests, I want to make sure I inject and create a module called OIT-GLM app. Now, where you find this at is, oops, so batch is here. You can see where our default module name is OIT-GLM app. And so it will actually create this module with these injected services or injected modules in with it. So this is needed before every single test. The next line here is we're creating a variable to hold our service that we are trying to test. So in the next line, what we are doing is we are injecting into our modules here an instance of our new service. Now you see a bunch of __. In Angular, whenever you inject something and you want to use that name over again, you can do a __ on the module name, and Angular will actually strip that out and use that. So an example is if for some reason we need to get scope and we want to name it $scope, like this. When we inject it, we have to do a _$ scope _, and then when we apply this, we can apply it like this. And so now in our integrated test, when we actually want to use that scope, we can use the $ scope, and it looks a little bit more like what we have in our actual service or in our controller, rather than just having a scope name. Okay. And the next line is the actual test. So every single one of the tests starts with IT. It's basically integrated tests, and we'll have a description of what you're doing, and then a function is what is passed into it. Okay, and Jasmine has a bunch of matchers. Let me show you those real quick.
So Jason, I got a quick question. So
yeah.
the OIT GLM app, so why is that the default again?
This one? Okay, so, yeah, so if we look at, let me bring that back up.
Is it because where we added the service?
Well, okay, so this is our default module. Okay, and this is where we need to test stuff inside of. So
I guess the reason why I'm wondering, because GLM will not be our default module.
Right. So for you guys, it will be OIT batch.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just whatever module your default module is, it just needs to be instantiated so that it can do all of this stuff here, and then run the config. It will not run the run, but will run the config.
Okay. So when we added from the command line, when you added the service.
Yep.
Was because we were in the OIT GLM?
Yes. So if I bounce up here, so let me bounce up one, go into OIT batch.
So if you would have done the same thing there, then it would.
Yeah. So if I run it from here, it will show up as OIT batch app.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So let me pull this page over. So this is the Jasmine homepage. It gives you a lot of good descriptions on how to write Jasmine tests. But here, about maybe a fourth of the way down is the matchers. And so the matchers are expect. Now expect something to happen. So this is the very basic one where I expect true to be true. Okay, and so it does exactly what you think it does. Is it's comparing true, and it really expects them to be the same, and it will give you a result of pass or fail for that particular test. The negative is not, so you just put not to be true, and that will be the negative. It gets more complicated ones, so like two equals. So this is for simple literals and variables, and so if things are actually, if a number is equal to a number, then this equals will pass. The matcher is for regular expressions, and so it doesn't, if you have a regular expression, these things will pass. To be defined. So this is if a variable is null or undefined, then this will fail. On this line, it will actually pass. And then you have to be undefined, which is the opposite of to be defined. But then you also have even null. So if you want something to actually be null, not undefined, then you can test that kind of stuff. And then probably the more complicated one is to be truthy. The reason why is because with JavaScript, you do have the idea of a number can be also a string, and so when you want it to be exactly something, then you can do to be or match. Where if you just want it to be something that is similar and the values inside of it be similar, then that's what the to be truthfully is. Okay. And there's a bunch more in here. I would recommend going out to the Jasmine homepage and kind of looking at most of them. For the most part, you're going to be using probably 2 or 3 things. You'll just be using the to be, not to be, and probably the to be defined. Okay. So this is the very basic test. Now, if you don't want a test to run, actually, let me go ahead and launch this real quick. So what I'm doing is I'm going to run the grunt test and give it a second to get going here. Oh, and I have a failure. So this is what a failure will look like. And it's probably something I need to look at. Something didn't get passed in properly. Oh, the service didn't get put into the files directory, and that's why it failed. So what I'm going to do real quick, just so I can move forward on this, I'm going to go ahead and delete that new test and go over the test that we already have. So let's come back here. And services, delete the new one. And then, here we go, services, new services, delete. Yes. Oops. And you can see, since I have this as single run as false, my tests are continuously running. So every change that I make, these tests are running. You can see that I have one test that passed, and I can tell you that test that passed is this one right here. So this is off the main controller. Basically all we're doing is we create the controller, and then there is a scope item called tax items. We just want to make sure it's 3 items. So let's look at that real quick, because I want to go more over the services first, but this is a good one to also look at. So main.js in the controllers, here it is. So here's the default controller, and it's very basic. All it does is it creates a scope item called tax items, and it has 3 items in it. It has tax 1, W2, and 1099. So when I run my test here, you can see here's the default. I want to make sure my model gets instantiated. I have 2 variables. I have my main controller and scope. And then before each one of these tests, I want to inject a controller, and I want to inject a $ controller, and I want to inject the $ root scope. The first line here is taking a root scope and creating a isolated scope, and that's what this does. Is root scope dot $new will create a new isolated scope on for me, and then this line is instantiating a controller. So $controller, that method will pass in what controller I want to instantiate, and then any of the injected items I need to inject. So in this case, I want to set that the $scope is this new isolated scope that I created. So, this is the basics for every single controller that you need to do. And so you want to create an isolated scope for yourself and inject that. So when you look at the test here, this is my injected item. So anything that you inject into your controller, you need to make sure in your test that you have either created a mock item for that, or you have created an object that you can inject and instantiate inside of this controller method. Any questions about that piece? Okay, good. So this integrated test here is basically just saying, okay, well, I got my scope item, and I got the array of it, and the length is, should be 3. Okay, now what we can do now is, say we take this to 2. You can see here the test failed. In fact, let's do this real quick. Let's do it like that. So then if I come back here, I say, okay, I want it to be 3, control save, and you can see it passed. Okay? So we have a couple of modules that I have already, or not modules, but services I have already brought over. And let's look at the data service one first. This is the one. Okay. So here's a service that basically what it does is we have 4 methods. We have a create data service, get data service, save data service, and delete data service. And they have functions that they are mapped to inside of our factory here. And so the very top one is create data, and all it really does is it will take a resource handler that is passed into it and call a get method on that particular guy. So we want to test that. So we come over here to data services. You can see I have all my tests already written, but I've created an X in front of it. And what the X does, it says do not run this test. Okay. You can see here at the top I have what I named this particular set of tests that I want to run. It's services, and it's testing the data services. The next very top line is I want to make sure I get my default module that this data service is in. I want to have it there. Then I have 3 variables that I want to have. I want to have a resource handler, a data service, and a root scope. And then I'm passing in I'm injecting into this services my data service that I created in the root scope. Okay, so this is very similar to the default one that we created earlier with Yeoman. And so actually when I created this particular data service, I did use Yeoman to create it, and then just ported over all the stuff from GOM that we have today. So the very next line here is, let's just make sure that our data service got instantiated. So if I take off the X, Control S, my test passed. Okay, you can see here it went from executed 1 of 1 to executed 2 of 2. That means I have 2 tests that ran and both of them passed. So the next one is create data. So when we look at the actual service here, this is my create data that I want to test. And all I'm doing, like I said, is I'm returning a get return from a resource handler. Now, one of the things we have to understand is there's 3 types of tests that we want to do over a course of an application. One is unit test, and this is what we're going over today. And unit test is all about your code. It's all about the things that are happening within your code. Things happening outside the code that you don't have control over right now, you don't really care about, and you will mark all those items out, and you'll use different tests to test whether or not your stuff works well with others. The second is mid-level testing, and what mid-level testing is moving your stuff together where you are dependent on other functions, other classes, and you don't necessarily mark everything out. You just mark endpoints. So something that is calling a web service, you'll mark that. You'll mark maybe data coming in. You may mark some third-party libraries that you really don't have control over. You may mark those also, but you're testing more of the internal stuff. The third piece is end-to-end testing. And with that, what you're doing is you're actually putting it out somewhere and you're hitting back-end databases. You're expecting certain data to make it from point A to point B. You're testing across usually a pathway. And so you test several pages and several modules going on. What we're going over today is just unit testing. And I want to make sure that's clear that we're just doing unit tests right now and going over unit testing. And that's why when you look at this particular test here, this is the creation of, or the testing of create data. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to mock, because we're passing something into us, we want to mock that resource handler that we need to pass in. And that's what this line does. We create an object called resource handler. It has a method called get, which when you looked at this method here, that's what it's calling, is get. And we want to return from that method a success. Once again, since this is the unit test, I'm not really concerned about what that resource handler will actually get from a backend database, because my test doesn't do anything with that data. It's just taking that data and spitting it back up the call stack. And so since I do nothing with the data, this return can be anything at this point, because I'm not doing anything with it, and it's not my responsibility inside my unit test to even know anything about this particular return statement. The next line here is I got my data service, and I am calling the method create data service, and I'm passing in my mock data, and I want to know what I got back from that return statement. So this is what I'm setting up a vol for that. So the next line is I want my return data to equal whatever I returned here, and I want to make sure that the return data wasn't false. So this is a negative test here. Okay, so I'll save this, and you can see here that test ran successfully. So any questions about this particular test right here? So this is a very simple unit test that is testing a method that really doesn't do a whole lot, and we're not really doing anything, but we just want to test that we are executing something at this particular point. Okay. So the reason why I want to talk a little bit more about this particular these tests is because we actually do some interesting stuff inside of this call stack. So the next one will show that, and it is the get promise. Okay. So if we look down here, we have a method called get promise, which is actually called from this get data service. So we come up here and we say get promise. So the first thing we do is we do a queue deferred, which means that we are passing back to the caller a promise to fulfill this data at some point. Okay. We then have a method here called get data, a method we are calling called get data, which is passing in a filter criteria, a resource handler, which you can see here. So this get data does the same thing. It is creating a promise, and it is making a call with the resource handler to query the database with this filter criteria. When it is done, it will resolve, which will mean that it had been successful. It will resolve that data and pass back the data that it has. So that's what this is. And then up here, we call the then on our promise, and when it's finished, we'll get the response back, and then we will resolve all promise with the data that we have. So we have two promises that we're calling, and to get this data, and we're basically passing this up a stack trace or a stack of calls in our methods that basically just takes the data, and we're just passing it from the resource handler up to the calling method that we have. So we need to test that somehow. So this is what this test does. Okay, so the first thing is I create a couple of vols. I have my data that I'm passing in, and then I have my filter criteria, which is nothing. Here's my resource handler. And you see in the resource handler, I have a query. The query has three methods or three parameters inside of its function, which is the filter, the callback, and the callback error. Okay, so if you ever look at queue, this is what queue is actually, or queries, this is what queries actually is looking for. And I want to do the success of this, so my return is the callback method and make it a success. Okay? And then, so here's the call to my service. I'm calling the get data service. So if we look here, that's the get data service, which is this promise method, which is data, resource handler, filter criteria. And here's our three pieces. And so the first thing I want to do is, on this variable, I'm expecting that there is a then on my promise that got called back, and I want it to be defined. Okay, so this is one of the other types of specs that I tell you is very useful, is to be defined. So what that means is that if I didn't get back a promise, then I probably didn't get back a then. And so that will be undefined. So something happened, something was wrong, someone changed something on my data service that I'm not getting back a promise like I was supposed to. Okay. This digest, so Angular has rewritten Q slightly different from the original Q JavaScript. And the reason being is that when Angular is going through the frames of JavaScript, if Q returns a success or a failure, it needs to fire off a digest to move forward in the JavaScript frame event loop. Okay. If you don't do that, then there's a lot of weird things that can happen in Angular, and things will not appear on the page when they come back because nothing has happened to advance the event loop any and tell the system that you need to redraw on the page. So to get a promise to actually fire, even in the test, you have to tell the digest, I want to digest and go the next step in the frame stack. And that's what this line does, is we got the promise back, but the promise will never fulfill unless we move Angular forward in the call stack, and that's what this line does here. We move that first promise that we did here, we move this forward one step, and this will actually be able to be called at this point. So that promise gets fulfilled, and so now we can actually call all promise that we got back. So that's what this does, is we're calling the then, and this promise needs to be fired by calling digest a second time. So this digest is this inner promise, and then the second digest is to fulfill this promise. Okay. Since I'm doing the callback here, this callback means success, this is the success part of a promise. And I expect that whatever I put here will be success. And this test will succeed. Once again, since this is a unit test, I'm not really concerned with what I'm actually returning. I just want to know that I return something that I'm passing back up the call stack at this point. So I can make this anything I want. I can make it a real complicated object, or I can just do what I did here and just make it success. Okay, so then we do this. You can see that that test succeeded, and it passed both of these expected. Okay, any questions on that real quick? Because that's, like I said, it gets a little bit more complicated having to deal with promises and queues, but I wanted to show it because as much as possible we should be using promises when we have to do something asynchronously, and we don't want to do a whole lot of nested ifs and nested callbacks if we can keep from doing that. Okay.
So I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So this is checking for if the promise returned at then, right? So what if we had to check for like a real data, like did it return back data? What do we do that at that point?
Okay, so yeah, so
it's a resource, but if let's say we call a web API and we get back, what do we do at that point?
Right. So what you would inject at this point up here is there's a HTTP backend. Let me see if I have one over here, if I remember right. Yeah. So if you actually have to, if you're making a call and you have to basically mark that data, you have what we call a HTTP backend. So here's the HTTP backend that you inject in. Here is the assigning it to a variable that all of the tests can use. And then here's where half the magic works. So HTTP backend expect that if you have a GET with this URL, then respond with this data. Okay, and so this data returned up here is the data that I have there, which is year, column 2. Okay. Then what you have to do is you have to flush it, which means actually send the data or pretend that you received the data back and then step through the call stack at that particular point. And then what will happen here, since I flushed it and I have this promise that I'm trying to fulfill, here's what all my expects are. And so that data is this data that's returned. And so data column 1, which is this, should be column 1. Year should be 2000, or should not be 2012, because my year is actually 2013. And so this is how you mock data from backend services. Now, if you actually have to test data from the database, that has to be end-to-end testing, and that's not covered in this. That will be covered in stuff that we do with Protractor, and at that point you have to point to a live server, and it's a little bit more complicated on that. But the way you have written your data services and stuff right now, to be honest with you, you would not have to use HTTP backend probably at all, because you can mock everything before you even get to it. It's one of the problems with taking the dollar resource and creating it in one spot, passing it into another class, that all it does is execute it, because there's nothing really to execute at that point. You know, you can mark that data coming in, or you can mark that class coming in, and you can mark it on the other side a different way, and we'll go into that in just a second. Did I answer your question? Okay. So I did this test here, which is basically the same test as before. The only difference on this one was I created another resource handler that the callback was on an error. And so here, I save the data, I do my promise, but you can see here the first attribute is null, which is a success, and this is the error. And I want to check to see that if I call the callback on the error, that I did get error back at that point. And then the other two tests are basically the same, so let's run these. All my tests passed. Okay, now, the reason why I like doing things this way with it continuously checking is, so say I come into here and I'm working on my test and I have all this going over here, and I make this a post. And I save it. I can immediately see that a test has failed at that point. Now I got undefined. So what that means is that I've changed something that someone was trying to test, or I was trying to test, and it failed. Now, I may want that to happen, and so I just know it, but it will at least tell me, hey, go fix your test before you start moving too much further and checking this in. When we start doing more mid-test, that's where this becomes even more important, because I may change something on my class. I added or took out an attribute on a object that I'm passing back to another class. Well, they may be doing something to that class and they may be testing it. And so if I make that change, it will then fail their test, and I got to figure out why it failed their test, and maybe I need to go into that class and make some changes in it also. So this gives you some more ways of testing that is a little bit better than just, I'm going to just write all my classes and then check it in, and I'll do testing later because it's not quite as important. I gotta get the deadline done. Well, you may be breaking a lot more than you realize by doing that. So I also created a TCC factory, or actually I copied that one over. So let's look at that one real quick. Let's see, GML service, this is him. Okay, so this particular test is very hard to test because we're not really doing anything in this class. All we're doing is we're calling our data service and then calling a method on it and just returning these without really doing anything. But we still need to test it somehow. So this is the TCC factory test. And it does a couple of different things here. And so the first thing you want to see here is we include our default module. Then we have our before each here. This before each is a little bit different. So I need to be able to mark my data service that I am injecting into this object. So if you look here, you can see here I am injecting into my factory here the data service that I just showed you a second ago. Okay, but I need to actually have some. I don't want to use a real data service because I'm trying to do unit testing and not mid-level testing at this point. So what I do here is I have to somehow inject it with a mock data, and this is how you do that. Is this before each here? Is you do a module, and you need to inject a provide. Okay, and then here's my mock object. It has the same methods that we have on the data service. It's just the returns are actually mocked out a little bit. Once again, because I'm doing just unit testing, I'm not really concerned about, and I'm not doing anything with the data. I'm not that concerned about the data coming into my object because I'm not doing anything with that data. I'm just spitting it back up to the one above me. So that's why all of these just return success. And that's all they do for these particular methods. This line here tells Angular that when you see data service, use this object instead of some other object. Okay? And that's what the provide does, is it allows you to substitute modules or objects or services or controllers or that kind of stuff is by this way. And then here we have our regular injections, and so we have the TCC factory that we're trying to test, and because we have the resource, we are injecting it also at this point. Okay? And the first line is our very, very basic test. Hey, are we creating our service, and is it, are we able to use it? Yes. Good job. So now we want to test the first function here. So we want to create data. All create data does is take the data service, create data service, and we are passing a resource handler. So here's the test. Jasmine has a very neat little method called spy-on, and what spy-on does is it will allow you to add extra matching properties on an object and allow you to check to see if things are going on inside of it. So what I did was I did a spy on my mock here, and what I'm spying on is this particular method, create data services. Okay? And so the next line is I want to see that this variable all is null. That means I haven't set anything with it and nothing has happened with it. The very next line is I want to call my TCC factory with the promise, or that it returns something. And then this actually probably should be something else, but we'll leave it that way. And then the next line is I'm now expecting that this all not to be null. I'm expecting something to be set here when I call this. Okay, so I call this method, the resource, I'm passing something in, I'm expecting this to be set, and then I'm expecting this to be passed. So if we look at our factory here, I'm just expecting that this does something. The next line here, this is why we did the spy on, is I'm wanting to know that on my mock data that method that I was spying on has been called. Okay, so if we look at the method that we called here, the only thing that happens here that I can really test is, did I call this method? There's nothing else happening here other than a return. So to do that, that's why I did this spy on, was so that I could expect that that method had been called. And then I'm expecting that, this fake data that I passed in, that I passed it right back out. Okay. Now, unfortunately for this particular class, since basically all of these are doing the exact same thing, the tests are exactly the same on all of these methods, because we're basically just calling another method on an object, and we're just passing it straight back up the stack without doing anything to it. So that's why all these tests are basically all the same. And so we actually uncomment all these. And we save it. You can see that all 12 have been successfully passed. One of the downsides to doing things this particular way is, so you take this. One of the things that we can't test because of it was written this way is what this URL is, because inside of here, $resource URL is a private variable within that object. And so I have no way of looking in here, since we just passed this guy in here, to know what got passed in, what this name was, or anything like that. So, if we needed to test which one we're passing in, we would have to change this up a little bit to expose that so we know what we're trying to pass into it. Okay, so that's doing services. I plan on doing some more calls over the next several days. We'll probably go over controllers on Monday, I'm hoping, and maybe go over some, we may do a little bit on directives and definitely filters. So you guys have any questions about any of the tests and how to write some of these tests so far? So I'm hoping by the end of today that WIP has been updated and we'll be able to check in all this code into the WIP directories. If you go out to GLM, there are some tests out there already. So you can also look in GLM under the specs. There's about 4 or 5 different tests inside of it also. So until we get this checked in, that's another good resource. We'll also have to talk about how to test modules, because those are a little bit different sitting in those directories, but we'll talk about that sometime next week.
So WIP was checked in, was updated yesterday morning. So it
okay,
should be
so
there now.
Okay, now I'll have this stuff checked in this afternoon, and you guys can look at it at your leisure.
Right.
Any other questions, guys?
So Jason, when
Yep.
this recording comes back, let me know, and I'll put it out on our wiki. So.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thanks, guys.
One suggestion I want to make is, this is, maybe we need to go a little slow. This is a lot of information being thrown at a very really fast rate. So maybe we might want to take a smaller piece. That's what I think. If everyone is okay, then I'm fine. But I think it is a little time consuming to understand and follow.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Yeah, and we'll over the next week, I'm hoping at least every other day, if not every day, have a 15, 30-minute, hour call that people can ask questions, and we can go over, different pieces. Or if someone has an issue, we can talk about it, of how to get around it or how to solve it. So, this isn't the only time we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about a lot over the next week and a half.
Okay.
So I expect the developers will sit down and start doing this and have just tons of questions. So you won't know what you won't know until you start doing it. And this video will help for reference, but also, Jason will be available for help. And anybody that's done any of this can also help too. So it's a lot of learning, and we just basically have to start trying it and learn it. So.
Right.
Yeah, Jason, I really appreciate the things that you've put together and you're trying to give us, sharing this knowledge with us. I agree with Vinod.